So here we are in part 2, looking at the storied world of the Bible. Yesterday was incredible, but I can guarantee you today is going to be mind-blowing as Tom puts together Genesis 1, 2, and 3. And if you listen carefully, you will begin to see the world through a completely different set of eyes. What we're going to do is just listen to the reading, go into the talk, and then we'll call it there without me babbling on at the end. So, just before we dive into that, let's start by saying the Jesus Creed out loud together. Hear, Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. And the second is this: love your neighbor as yourself. There are no commands greater than these. Right, here's part 2 of this fascinating discovery of the Bible.
The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to till it and keep it. And the Lord God commanded the man, "You may freely eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it you shall die." Then the Lord God said, "It is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him a helper as his partner." So out of the ground the Lord God formed every animal of the field and every bird of the air, and brought them to the man to see what he would call them. And whatever the man called each living creature, that was its name. The man gave names to all cattle, and to the birds of the air, and to every animal of the field. But for the man there was not found a helper as his partner. So the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man, and he slept. Then he took one of his ribs and closed up the place with flesh. And the rib that the Lord God had taken from the man he made into a woman, and brought her to the man. Then the man said, "This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman, for out of man this one was taken." Therefore a man leaves his father and his mother, and clings to his wife, and they become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked, and they were not ashamed. So we begin at the beginning. Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. One of the most memorable and extraordinarily powerful sentences anywhere in all literature, and obviously anywhere in the Bible. But, of course, Genesis has been a problem for many people in our world, not least in the last 200 years, when people routinely say, somebody said to me in a letter just the other day, "Of course I can't accept the first 2 or 3 chapters of Genesis." And I wanted to say, when you say you can't accept it as what? And of course the trouble there has been that many people have said you must take it absolutely literally, by which they mean this is what you'd have seen if you'd had a video camera for 6 periods of 24 hours. Suddenly all these different things appear. And that, as many, many scholars in many different traditions have been telling us for years, is simply not how to read this particular story. So what is Genesis 1, 2 and 3 all about? One of the most remarkable things springs to life when we compare Genesis 1, 2 and 3 with other stories about how the world began from the world of the time, the world of roughly the first 2 millennia BC, because there were, as there are today, many stories about how everything got going. And in many of those ancient stories, the world as we know it is seen as a bad thing, as a dark and sad and gloomy place, created either by a bad God or by a fairly incompetent God, or created as a bad place in contrast to a good place. And one of the first and most important things that Genesis chapters 1 and 2 are saying is this world is the good creation of a good God, and indeed, when he'd completed it, he said it was very good. And it was very good for a particular reason. That Genesis chapter 1 is written in such a way as to tell the story of the construction of a particular kind of building. And the building in question is what in the ancient or the modern world we would call a temple. We know a lot about temple building in the ancient world. Not only Jews built the tabernacle and then the temple, but also many cultures built temples. Probably every culture built temples to their gods or goddesses. And these temples were places where the gods' realm and the human realm met and were held dangerously together. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The whole creation is a heaven plus earth unity. One of the main things that Genesis tells us is that heaven and earth were not meant to be far apart. They were made for one another so that God and his human creatures and the whole of the rest of creation would be there all together, not in a muddle, differentiated, but a unity within that differentiation. So creation is good, and it is the place where heaven and earth come together, and it is constructed as a place, therefore, for God's own dwelling. The 6 stages, they're called days in this extraordinary poem we know as Genesis 1. The 6 stages of creation are the stages in the construction of a temple. We've got plenty of evidence, including Solomon's temple in 1 Kings, which are constructed in this 6-fold way. And when at the end of that construction we are told that God rested, this doesn't just mean God sat back because his job was complete. It means that God came to take his rest in this construction which he had made. We see this in one of the Psalms, in Psalm 132, where God declares that he's chosen Zion, Jerusalem, as his resting place. This is where he will come and live. This is where he will be, if you like, at home and come and take his ease. He will feel at home there. It'll be natural for him to be there. This is, of course, a very difficult idea for us modern Westerners who tend to think, according to the ancient philosophy called Epicureanism, that heaven is a long way up in the sky, if it's anywhere at all, and that we are separated from it by a great gulf. So the idea of God and humans, of heaven and earth, coming together into one is, in our regular phrase, counterintuitive. We just can't imagine that. Part of the problem there is with our modern Western imagination, not with anything inherently odd about the ideas themselves. Many people in the ancient world would have regarded that as the norm and would have regarded our split-level world of heaven and earth totally apart as the very odd thing which they found it hard to imagine. But if the original creation was good, and indeed it says very good, it was, it seems, incomplete, because creation in Genesis chapters 1 and 2 seems to be not a tableau, but a project. It's not just that God makes something which sits there like a picture, like a model that you might see in a storefront window, which people just admire as it is, but it's a project, it's going somewhere. And so the humans who are created at the heart of the project, I'll come back to that in a moment, they have a job to do. What God is doing is launching something which is going somewhere. And though this is very mysterious, it looks, when we put the whole thing together, as though Genesis is telling us about what happens who knows how many millennia after the original Big Bang, as we now think of it as, when God calls a human pair and says, I have a special job for you to do. I want you to make this world into a lovely, glorious place. I want you to look after it on my behalf. And I want it to be a place where heaven and earth come together, where you, as the human pair, as those who are going to produce more humans, you will be the people through whom creation as a whole will celebrate and worship the Creator. And so humans are created in the divine image. This is so important. Humans are not just a little bit that's broken off when God finished doing something else. Humans are not an accident, a sort of a cosmic freak that just happened like this. One of the main things that Genesis 1 is teaching us is that humans have a very special, unique place within the entire design and narrative of creation. Genesis talks about this in terms of the image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. And he said then, be fruitful and multiply. He blessed them and said, fill the earth, subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth. This is a vocation. Many theologians have puzzled about what it might mean to say that humans are made in the image of God. Many have suggested that perhaps it's something to do with the human mind or imagination or will or memory or something like that, something which we've got which makes us a little bit like God, so that when God looks at us, he sees a sort of bit of himself at least reflected in a mirror. That's not the point of the language of the image. If you start with the idea of an ancient temple, then from that temple, you can say, well, what's missing in this temple? Every ancient temple, except the Jewish temple, had an image in it, an image of the god, so that the worshippers who came in could see who the god was and could offer the god or the goddess their worship and sacrifices and so on. And so that the presence of that god would somehow be vested in this statue, this image, this portrait, so that people would sense the power and majesty and awesomeness of the god when they were faced with the image. So God makes heaven and earth as a temple, and he puts into this temple an image of himself, so that creation around can appropriately worship him through that image, and so that the power and love and stewardship and sovereignty of God can be exercised in the world, again, through the image. In other words, it isn't that the image is a mirror in which God is reflected back to God. The image is an angled mirror through which the worship of creation is reflected up to God, and the stewardship and love and purposes of God are reflected out into the world. So humans as image goes with creation as temple, goes with creation as good, as designed to be a good world, a united world, an integrated world, with humans at the focal point of that integration. Now, the humans are made male and female, and this, it seems, is part of this integration which we see throughout Genesis 1. Genesis 1 has the heavens and the earth, it has the sea and the dry land, it has different types of vegetation, some of which themselves have male and female characteristics. It has the animal kingdom, and again, they obviously have male and female characteristics. So being male and female isn't specific to being image-bearing humans, but it is part of the rhythm of creation, part of the natural shaping, the ordering of God's world. And as we see on from Genesis into the rest of the Bible, the heaven and earth duality, made to be complementary, made to come together, is reflected in many other of those dualities, and particularly in the male-female duality, so that just to look for a moment right across at the very end of the Bible, in Revelation 21 and 22, when the New Jerusalem comes down from heaven to earth, heaven and earth are joined together. And the image which the writer uses is that the New Jerusalem is like a bride adorned for her husband. So we have the male and female coming together at the end of the Bible as they are there together at the beginning of the Bible. Something about the unity of God's creation, about the coming together of that which might appear different, as in the Epicurean distance between heaven and earth. This is built in to the structure from the beginning. So when then we move through Genesis 1 and 2 and reach Genesis 3, often regarded as the fall, the time when humans sinned, it isn't just that God gave the humans a command that you mustn't eat from this particular tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and that they broke the command. We can easily hear it like that, because we in the modern Western world have lived in a world of moralism ever since the philosopher Immanuel Kant, thinking of a categorical imperative, a big law hanging in the sky, do this and don't do that. We read Genesis 3 like that. Oh dear, we have turned the whole thing into a moralistic game. Genesis 1 and 2 is about a vocation, and Genesis 3 is about a failure of allegiance, resulting in a failure of vocation. Instead of giving allegiance to the Creator God, the human pair give allegiance to one of the creatures in the garden, the serpent, the snake, and as a result, they fail to be loyal to God. They fail to live in the way that they were meant to, as people channeling the worship of creation to the Creator God and channeling his stewardship into the world. And the result is that they are expelled from the garden. Now, already we can see something very interesting in the whole story, the larger biblical story, which I, as a Bible reader since I was quite young, never saw until comparatively recently. That the story of this couple being given a lovely garden, being given a task to do and commands to keep, failing and being ejected. This is the story that every Jew from the 5th century BC onwards knew only too well. It is the story of Israel. Israel being given the land of promise. Israel being given the Torah to keep. Israel failing in that vocation, and as a result, being expelled and sent off to Babylon. And I think when we're trying to understand Genesis through the eyes and in the hearts and minds of Jews of what we call the Second Temple period, this ought to be front and center, that they know this is their story, that somehow Israel has recapitulated the story of Adam and Eve, and that the problem of the ongoing exile, to which we shall return in a later segment, is in its essence the same as the problem of the human race as a whole. That is one of the large clues to how the Bible as a whole operates, one of the clues to which we will be returning a little bit later. Nevertheless, the humans still know that they are there to have a family and to look after the land. After Adam and Eve have been kicked out of the garden, Cain, who then murders his brother, Cain nevertheless starts a family and builds a city. That raises all sorts of other questions, which is one of the reasons why I and many others don't think that Adam and Eve were the only hominids around at the time, that there were others who were to be brought into the project. But what is then going on is that Cain knows in his bones that even though something is out of kilter because of the murder and so on, that nevertheless there is something about human community, about colonization of space, about looking after the land, which he nevertheless has to do. Of course, the trouble with that is that as the story goes on from Genesis 3 and 4 all the way to Genesis 11, with Noah and the ark in the middle of that narrative, the result is the Tower of Babel. That the human pride, which says, I don't need to worship God, I'm going to listen to the voice of the snake instead. The human pride, which says, I don't want to run this world God's way, I want to run it my way. That results in this great symbol of human arrogance, of human idolatry, of self-idolatry, which is the construction of the Tower of Babel. And again, as every Jew in Jesus' day would know, Babel and Babylon are basically the same. The exile from the garden results in this arrogant Tower of Babel. The exile from the land results in exile in Babylon. And that, in a sense, is where the story really starts as far as the early Christians are concerned. So when we get Genesis 1, 2, and 3, even quite briefly as I've done it just now, we begin to see that this is not just a very odd thing stuck on the front, but is the beginning and the source and the generating framework within which the rest of the Bible and its great story means what it means.